Greaves, changing direction so well.
He's got the goalkeeper now.
Season remains a club record.
Wembley Stadium, July 30th, 1966. England are about to play West Germany in the World Cup final, and the most dangerous goal scorer the country had ever produced isn't on the pitch. He's watching. Dressed in a suit, sitting in the stands, carrying 14 stitches in his shin and a wound that had nothing to do with French studs and everything to do with the brutal logic of team sport. England won that day, 4-2. Geoff Hurst scored a hat-trick, Martin Peters scored, and Jimmy Greaves, the man who had scored 44 goals in 57 international appearances, who had claimed 6 First Division Golden Boots, who had terrified every goalkeeper and center-back in Europe for the better part of a decade, never kicked another ball for his country. So how does the most feared finisher in English football history end up watching the greatest moment in English football history from the stands? And what exactly made Jimmy Greaves so terrifying that the men who faced him, trained against him, and played beside him kept reaching for words like genius and impossible and supernatural even years after he was gone? Let's rewind. James Peter Greaves turned professional in the summer of 1957. He was 17 years old and playing for Chelsea, and on August 24th of that year, he made his league debut away at White Hart Lane against Tottenham Hotspur. He scored in a 1-1 draw. First professional appearance, first professional goal. That was how it started, and it almost never stopped. In the Tottenham dressing room afterward, the Spurs captain Danny Blanchflower had seen enough. "This boy is a natural," Blanchflower said. He seemed to know just what to do. That was it. No lengthy analysis. Just 4 words from one of the most intelligent footballers of his generation, delivered immediately and without hesitation about a 17-year-old who had just scored against his team. Blanchflower had recognized something in those 90 minutes that would take the rest of English football nearly a decade to fully absorb. Because Greaves wasn't fast in the conventional sense. He wasn't physically imposing, 5 feet 8 inches, compact, unremarkable on a team sheet. He didn't hammer the ball into the net like a battering ram. What he did was harder to explain, and infinitely harder to stop. He understood space inside the penalty area the way a chess grandmaster understands the board. Quietly, precisely, and always several moves ahead. He occupied positions that defenders had already decided were safe. And then, with a composure that bordered on the insulting, he passed the ball into the net. By the end of the 1958-59 season, he was the First Division's top scorer. He was 18 years old. The numbers that followed are the kind that still stop you mid-sentence when you read them. In the 1960-61 season, Jimmy Greaves scored 41 goals in 40 league games for Chelsea. 41. He was 20 years old. He finished as the top scorer in the entire division, won his 2nd Golden Boot, and became the youngest player in English football history to reach 100 league goals, achieving that landmark at just 20 years and 290 days. On the final day of that season, he captained the side and scored all 4 goals in a 4-3 win over Nottingham Forest. Chelsea were not challenging for the title, but their striker was individually the most productive goal scorer on the planet. But Chelsea were not the club to contain him forever. That summer, they accepted a fee of around £80,000 from AC Milan. Greaves went to Italy. He hated it. Not the goals, he scored 9 in around 10 appearances, but the suffocating tactical system under manager Nerio Rocco, the restrictions on how forwards were permitted to think and move, the whole rigid defensive architecture of Italian football at its most extreme. By December of 1961, Tottenham Hotspur had agreed to bring him home. The fee was £99,999, £1 deliberately short of £100,000. Manager Bill Nicholson didn't want the weight of that number sitting on his striker's shoulders. Greaves' debut for Tottenham was against Blackpool. He scored a hat-trick, including a scissors kick that the White Hart Lane crowd talked about for weeks. He was 21 years old and had now scored on his debut for every club he had represented. The Tottenham side he joined had already won the double in 1960-61. They were not done. In the 1962 FA Cup final against Burnley, Greaves opened the scoring inside 3 minutes. Spurs won 3-1. A year later in Rotterdam, Greaves scored twice as Tottenham dismantled Atletico Madrid 5-1 in the European Cup Winners' Cup final, the game that made Spurs the first British club in history to win a major European trophy. He had been sent off in the semi-final and served his suspension, then came back to score twice in the most important match of the club's history. That tells you something about the temperament as well as the talent. Bobby Charlton, who observed Greaves from close quarters through their shared years with England, believed defenders could mark him perfectly for 89 minutes, track every run, cut off every angle. Never give him a clean touch, and still lose because the one moment he found himself free was the only moment that ever mattered. His entire game was built around that single exchange. Find space once, finish. One chance was all he required. From 1964 onward, Greaves had a new partner at Spurs in Alan Gilzean, a tall, intelligent forward whose hold-up play and selfless link work created exactly the space that Greaves needed. Gilzean understood the partnership from the inside better than anyone. He described Greaves as a nightmare for defenders, a striker whose movement was so difficult to read that opponents were often beaten before Greaves had even touched the ball. The anticipation worked in both directions simultaneously. Greaves felt where the ball would arrive. Gilzean sensed where Greaves would be standing when it did. For the defenders caught between those two understandings, there was no good answer. Bobby Moore, who played alongside Greaves for England and later at West Ham, knew what it meant to track elite forwards in training every single day. Quick feet, sharp turns, instinctive movement that gave no telegraph signal. Moore believed Greaves had an almost supernatural ability to know where the ball would land before anyone else on the pitch had processed the information. And that was the assessment of the man widely regarded as the finest defender England has ever produced. Martin Peters, who made his living creating chances for others, described Greaves as England's ultimate finisher. Forwards and midfielders, Peters said, gained confidence simply from knowing that Greaves was at the end of the move because he didn't waste them. The composure was what set him apart from every other striker of the era. Not just the technique, but the absolute absence of doubt in the moments that mattered most. Gordon Banks faced Greaves in training more times than he could count. Banks explained that Greaves gave goalkeepers almost nothing to work with in one-on-one situations. No lean in the body, no tell in the eyes, no advanced signal of any kind. The ball would be in the net before the calculation was complete. Banks was the goalkeeper who later made what Pelé called the greatest save he ever witnessed. And Banks said Greaves was one of the most difficult finishers he ever had to face. Franz Beckenbauer, who played against England in that very World Cup final as a 20-year-old and spent the following decade as the defining figure of European football, consistently placed Greaves among the elite strikers of his era. The intelligence, the movement, the clinical finishing, the quality that meant defenders could never afford to lose sight of him for a single moment, because one moment of inattention was all Jimmy Greaves ever needed to make you pay. By the time the 1966 World Cup arrived, Greaves had scored 44 goals in 57 England appearances. His 6 international hat-tricks were an English record. He started the group games against Uruguay, Mexico, and France, and against Norway he had scored 4 goals in a 6-1 England victory. He was the sharpest weapon in Alf Ramsey's squad heading into the knockout stages. Then came the injury. In the final group game against France, a midfielder named Joseph Bonnell raked his studs down Greaves's shin. The wound needed 14 stitches. He missed the quarter-final against Argentina. Ramsey put Geoff Hurst in his place. Hurst scored the winner. England beat Portugal in the semi-final. Greaves was fit again by then. Ramsey kept the same 11. On July 30th, 1966, England beat West Germany 4-2 in the World Cup final at Wembley. Hurst scored 3 times. Peters scored once. Jimmy Greaves watched every minute from the stands, and then walked out onto the pitch with his teammates and joined the celebration, and later admitted that underneath everything, the sadness was real. He had spent his entire professional career dreaming of a World Cup final. He had missed it by 14 stitches and the cold arithmetic of a manager who would not break a winning team. Geoff Hurst never lost sight of what that sequence cost Greaves. Not what winning meant for England, but what it took from the man who had been displaced. There have been some great players, Hurst said years later, but forwards are judged on goals, and there's nobody who could touch him. He was asked once whether any animosity had existed between them, given that he had taken Greaves's place and scored a hat-trick in the final that followed. Not for 1 second, Hurst said. And then he was asked to find the single word that defined what Jimmy Greaves was. He didn't hesitate. Genius. In 1963, European football had already reached a similar verdict. That year's Ballon d'Or placed Greaves 3rd on the continent, behind only Lev Yashin and Gianni Rivera. The company he was keeping tells you exactly where the rest of the world had him ranked, even before the decade was out. In March of 1970, Greaves moved to West Ham United. His place at Tottenham had been lost after an FA Cup defeat to Crystal Palace, and the move sent Martin Peters in the opposite direction to Spurs. He scored on his debut, 2 goals in a 5-1 win at Manchester City. Yet the best of the career was behind him. By 1971, he had retired as a professional, and what followed was the hardest period of his life. Alcoholism that had been building beneath the surface consumed him once the structure of football was gone. He recovered in the late 1970s and emerged to build something entirely different. A television partnership alongside Ian St. John on St. and Greavesy, running from 1985 to 1992, that made him one of the most loved faces in British broadcasting. He died on September 19, 2021, aged 81. By then, the records had long since been written into the permanent fabric of the game. 357 goals in the English First Division, more than any player in the history of the competition, 6 Golden Boots, 44 international goals, a Ballon d'Or bronze, an FA Cup winners' medal, the first European trophy ever won by a British club, and a World Cup winners' medal that FIFA finally sent him in June of 2009, 43 years after the final he watched from the stands. He sold the medal at auction in November 2014. But here's what the numbers alone cannot account for, and what Bobby Charlton and Bobby Moore and Alan Gilzian and Gordon Banks and Geoff Hurst kept returning to long after the career had ended. Greaves didn't just score goals. He made scoring look like the only logical conclusion of any situation he was placed in, 357 times in the highest level of English football. A goalkeeper looked across the penalty area and found Jimmy Greaves standing somewhere he had no right to be and couldn't do a thing about it. That is not just a record, that is a verdict.